All things SciComm. What does the future of science look like? What's happening in science communication? Here's your host, Nikesh Gosalia.
Hi everyone, welcome to All Things SciComm. All Things SciComm is a weekly podcast brought to you by ScienceTalks, a media platform that aims to make science accessible to everyone. In this program, we dive into the latest from the sci-tech world. Let's get started with today's episode.
All things SciComm. Today's innovator. Knock knock.
Hi everyone, today I'm chatting with Duncan MacRae, who's the Director of Editorial Strategy and Publishing Policy at Wolters Kluwer Health. Duncan has spent nearly 25 years working in scientific journal publishing for societies and for the last 9 years with a commercial publisher. And like many of us here, he loves Wordle. Duncan and I know each other for, I think, over the last 10 years now. And I know that Duncan, for a fact, is one of the most entrepreneurial guys in the industry, and he's always open to new ideas. So welcome, Duncan.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. And again, nice to talk to you, as always.
We all know that Plan S is currently disrupting the scholarly publishing industry. Many journals have tried to adapt in one way or the other. You've spent the last 8 years working exclusively in open access at Wolters Kluwer before starting your new role. So I'm sure you are following all of these developments closely and seeing both the successes and the failures. Just based on your experience, Duncan, what should a journal avoid when transitioning from subscription-based to OA?
Probably the biggest thing is, that kind of transition is sort of figuring out what is the problem you're trying to solve by making that transition. And I think you have to ask some sort of hard questions about what you see for this journal if you make that transition. So this is actually not related to Plan S as much, even though, obviously Plan S has presented some hurdles that I'm not really sure wouldn't have been hurdles anyway, right? So when I think about transitioning from subscription to OA, the first thing is, okay, so where are those submissions coming from? Because now you're going from a model where you're basically a service to readers. The value is to the readers are paying to access the content. Now you're shifting to a model where the service is to authors. So they're the ones who are presumably in this model paying an APC. Of course, that's not required. But the question is, okay, where are these submissions going to come from now? And I think that's probably the biggest question and certainly the biggest debate that we have with societies who are thinking about launching new OA journals or shifting from subscription to open access. Presumably, shifting from subscription to OA is much easier if the subscription journal itself has some form of indexing already, something that is of value to authors. If that's not the case, then your life is going to be a lot more difficult. So in many ways, it's not so much the flipping that's the issue. The issue is, presumably there's something wrong with the journal that you're even considering this move. Does OA fix those problems? And that's really the question. And so it's a really basic point about flipping that to a great extent, Plan S doesn't really impact a lot of those really fundamental questions.
That's very interesting, Duncan, and thanks for pointing that out. I think the transitioning to OA also gives journals a chance to probably revisit some of the processes and, if I may call, inefficiencies in their workflows. Based on your experience, have you seen some of that? And what are some of the dated processes that probably journals still follow?
Well, I think it's a really good point. And so I already kind of touched on this a bit in terms of, okay, now you've got this journal and your primary customer now is not readers, it's authors. And I get that those are often the same people. But there's a lot more competition now. And there's a customer service aspect to this that I think 20 years ago didn't really exist, right? Because 20 years ago, you were a society journal. You may have been one of 2 or 3 high-profile specialty journals. Where else were authors going to go? And you had all the leverage in that relationship. And if you wanted to take 6 months to review something, you could take 6 months. If you wanted to have a backlog of manuscripts for a year before they got published, after acceptance, there really wasn't a whole lot an author could do with it. You, as the journal, had all the power. That is clearly no longer the case. And it hasn't been the case maybe really since the explosion of PLOS ONE and scientific reports and other kind of open access multidisciplinary titles. But now we're starting to see specialty OA titles also, become more prevalent. So talking about inefficiencies, really you're talking about providing a better experience for authors because they now have so many other places they could submit their manuscript. So, one of the things, for example, is, it sounds counterintuitive, but one of the inefficiencies that a lot of journals do that is not great for authors is they don't do enough desk rejects, right? So you get a manuscript, it doesn't fit the scope of the journal, or you read the abstract, it's clearly not going to get accepted. I think there are still a lot of journals that are in that mode of, well, we have to review everything that comes in, especially newly launched journals that are so desperate for submissions. The idea of not holding on to something seems foreign to them. But the fact is that authors really would rather have a quick rejection and be able to move on to somewhere else than to have the submission languish for 6 months and then get rejected when there was never a chance in the first place. So I think one inefficiency that journals really need to embrace is the idea that you can make a very quick triage and assessment of a manuscript and give the author the opportunity to submit it elsewhere as quickly as possible. I think that's a huge inefficiency. It also, the impact also on reviewer resources is huge, because everybody universally complains about reviewer fatigue. Well, the easiest solution to that, honestly, is to send less manuscripts out for review, So if you can triage and remove 25% of your submissions legitimately because they probably are not going to get accepted in your particular journal, then you're doing yourself and the author a great favor by making a very, very quick decision and letting them go elsewhere.
Speaking about OA, I've observed that comparatively fewer journals and publishers are thinking around discoverability or accessibility. How important will accessibility and discoverability solutions be in the future for journals and publishers, especially once the journal comparison service by Coalition S is widely accessible?
This is an issue that for newly launched journals is huge. And it's something that has really shifted over the last, let's say, 5 or 6 years, this idea of discoverability and accessibility, specifically in indexing. I think the idea that readers go to the journal website and look for content there is probably sort of on the wane, right? I mean, and we know from our statistics that most people are finding content by either, PubMed or Google, to a lesser extent, Web of Science. So getting a new journal into those indexes to increase your discoverability, but more importantly, to give your journal credibility, right? To ensure to authors that this is a valid place to submit your work is really, really important. I'm curious about Coalition S's journal recommendation service. I can't really comment on, Wolters Kluwer's position on it, but it'll be interesting to see to what degree that actually becomes a method via which authors are actually selecting journals. And the reason I say that is because, we do a lot of author surveys and there have been really good reports done, large reports done on why an author chooses, one journal over another. And there's also some cultural differences in terms of editorial freedom and academic freedom, to what degree an author should not be constrained as to where they submit their work. So I think there's a lot of different pieces of the puzzle here going on. But I think to go back to your original question about journals and discoverability and accessibility, this is a major hurdle for new launch journals, and I think that all of the indexes, whether it's PubMed Central or Medline, Scopus, Web of Science, they have all significantly changed their bar for acceptance in the last 5 to 7 years, effectively making it somewhat more difficult. They've all become a little more exclusionary. And I think that is that is sometimes a shock to editors and societies who are operating under a very old mindset that said, You launch a journal, you wait 2 years, you get into Web of Science. And it was a function of time. And in 5 years, you get your impact factor. Whereas the reality now is that there's a very good chance you'll never get an impact factor. And that's really hard to explain to journals who see getting an impact factor is absolutely strategically necessary. And now we're sort of saying, well, maybe not, or that may not happen for you.
And I know that, you spoke a bit about the peer review, and we all know the importance of the process. But if I were to maybe expand this, and assuming a lot of our listeners are, general public, if you can talk a little bit about the importance of the peer review process and what does it mean in the publishing industry?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate, as you say, sort of in the general public. And this is one of these things that came up during COVID with content being distributed amongst the media that was not peer reviewed. And so, peer review is, and there's a lot of criticism of peer review. And I've been in the industry for 25 years, and it is the constant sort of in the background noise of peer review is deeply flawed. We should be doing it this way. I work in medical publishing, which is slightly different than basic sciences. And the reason is because if somebody publishes a physics paper or a mathematics paper or a geology paper, there's no patient impact from that paper. Whereas in a medical paper, if I publish something that has not been peer reviewed and I make a dosage error in my conclusions or my results, the potential for harm is enormous. So there's a huge risk in things being published and distributed without being at some point vetted by someone who knows that, hey, this doesn't look right, or that conclusion really isn't valid because your sample size is too small. And it is really interesting to look at stories that get picked up in mainstream media, in layperson media, and the degree to which conclusions are presented as sort of, something groundbreaking. But when you and I look at it, or any scientist looks at it and say, well, the sample size is really small, the diversity of the sample was, you can't draw those conclusions. These are the kinds of things that peer review addresses. For all of its flaws, peer review does address fundamental problems with medical publishing that absolutely need to be recognized. And as I say, that's not necessarily true in some of the other sciences. And for that reason, in medical publishing, some of the alternatives to traditional peer review, post-publication review, transparency, they don't seem to have been adopted in medical publishing to the same degree because they don't really work in the same way. They don't have the same impact. And I know that there'll be people out there telling me, well, here are all the problems with peer review, traditional peer review. And I absolutely agree with every one of them. But the problem is that from a pragmatic standpoint, the kind of blinded two experts peer review system that's been in place for hundreds of years at this point, it's kind of there for a reason. So I tend to be a little bit conservative about it, about peer review. But to emphasize, I think in medical publishing in particular, peer review has to occur, because the risk of information being distributed that has not been vetted and the potential for impact on patient care is too high of a risk. So yeah, I certainly feel pretty strongly about that.
No, I think that's very helpful for anyone to understand the importance of peer review. Duncan, I know that, you've worked and you continue to do so. You work a lot with academic societies. And just over the last 2.5 years with the pandemic, we know that a lot from a society's point of view has changed. Perhaps they would have a lot of member events, a lot of conferences. In your opinion, how are they pivoting themselves going forward? How are they thinking about the next 3 to 5 years? Just any insights into that?
Yeah, I think it was a real eye-opener. And there are obviously a lot of societies where a good portion of their revenue is from annual meetings. I mean, the annual meeting in some societies may account for 50% of their annual revenue or more. So that has been very, very difficult. I think the flip side of it is that it has fast-tracked the development of all kinds of alternatives that probably were once dismissed, but people now recognize that you can do a virtual meeting and people will attend, and it can be useful. It's funny coming from the side of it where we used to do an awful lot of travel. And now, it'll never go back to the level of travel, in part because we've all recognized that, there's an awful lot that can be accomplished over a Teams call or a Zoom call where we would have felt compelled to go talk to people in person. And maybe to a certain degree, that will also bleed over into the societies as well. But clearly the societies, they have to make decisions now on their business model about to what degree they can rely on in-person meetings, to what degree they can shift to virtual meetings, to what degree can they now emphasize digital products over in-person. It's going to be really interesting. I mean, I think for you and I, we're just starting to get back into in-person travel. I went to my first, in-person workshop like 3 weeks ago, and it was good to be back in front of people. We'll both be at the SSP meeting in Chicago. It'll be interesting to see what the turnout is for that. That's usually one of the biggest meetings of the year in terms of sort of the scientific publishing world. So yeah, I mean, there's no question it's been very difficult for societies. The question is, what's the rebound going to be, and to what degree is the gap between the rebound and what it was before going to be filled with other technologies? I know as a commercial publisher that we've really emphasized developing alternatives, and what the staying power of those alternatives will be interesting to see to what degree. Okay, people really adopted a certain way of doing things as a substitute. Will those things have staying power over the next 3 to 5 years?
Thanks, Duncan. Very interesting. Just for the benefit of the listeners, Duncan referred to SSP conference. So that's the conference which is probably the biggest event of the year. This year is happening in Chicago. Duncan's going to be talking about, AI, and I have a session on early career researchers and how their dissemination patterns, are changing as well. So just for the listeners.
That's all the time we have today. Catch more of this episode in the next part with your host, Nikesh Gosalia. See you soon.